Good friend and colleague of ours, Steve Radelet, who for many years worked at our sister institute, the Center for Global Development, and some of their people were here, is now in the government, recently published a book saying that the outlook in Africa is actually a lot better than you suggested. He said there are 17 countries, Mali, Mozambique, you know the list, Ghana, Cape Verde, another half dozen on the cusp, which have been growing 5 to 6% a year for 15 years or more, seem to have achieved self-sustained growth, and the continent's looking up. Do you disagree with that sort of bottom line of his work, or are those exceptions to your conclusion, and or how did they overcome the problems that you described?
Okay, thank you very much. I think that if Cape Verde is a harbinger of Africa's performance, then I would say, unfortunately, that's a bit optimistic. The World Bank and United Nations have placed a target of 7% as the growth rate with which African countries, developing countries, need to grow at on a sustained basis in order to meaningfully put a dent in poverty. So 6%, I wouldn't be popping out the champagne just yet. I think that we're still far below the levels, most countries are still far below the levels that we need to be growing on a sustained basis in order for us to feel comfortable that we're on the right path. But there's more, I would say. Some of the obvious things that I think countries should be doing are simply they're not being done. Let me give you some examples. There are about 53 countries in Africa. Only about 16 countries have credit ratings. Now, some people might say, well, who cares about credit ratings? These are absolutely essential. It's kind of like saying as an individual, you don't have a credit rating. How could you possibly function in the United States without a credit rating? It's essentially translates in the same way. These countries, if they had credit ratings, and nobody's saying they need to rush out and go and issue debt, but there's something implicitly wrong for market participants. They look at a country, if you say, hey, do you want to invest in this country? The first thing they do on Bloomberg is check if the country's got a credit rating. If you don't have a credit rating, you're almost automatically viewed as a basket case, whether or not you've issued debt. And I think that there's a stigma associated with countries that don't have credit ratings, but here are a bunch of African countries, no credit rating. Foreign direct investment critically depends on those types of ratings, and we just don't see that happening anytime soon. I think it should be a conditionality for participation by donor agencies, but also it's absolutely a prerequisite for participating in the international community effectively. The other example of this, as I already alluded to, how can these countries really be mass participants when 1 billion people are less than 2% of global trade? I mean, again, there's something fundamentally wrong with getting all euphoric about Africa's contribution to the world if it's less than 2% and over 60% of the population is under the age of 24. These countries are not integrated anywhere near in the way that we would need them to be integrated. I talked about the World Bank's Doing Business survey. 60% of the countries, 30 out of 50 countries are at the bottom ranks, are the bottom 50 countries. There's something, again, implicitly wrong. How can you say that these countries are making any meaningful strides when these are very simple things? I would call it low-hanging fruit that the governments could change tomorrow. It need not take 2 years for a country to get for people to get business licenses in these countries. Clearly, the governments are not incentivized to actually get credit, to make it easier for people to do business and start businesses in these countries. Why should it be the case that 30 out of 50 countries at the bottom are all African? To me, I mean, there are so many other things I could point to. I think that if we really think that Africa is doing so well, then we really have low expectations of the continent.
Dambisa, another question relating to Africa, and that is, we see now the rising importance of a very different model of interaction with Africa, and that is what I might call the Chinese model of investment. It's not private investment, but it's not foreign aid either. Essentially, investment in order to get access to natural resources, which are plentiful in Africa, but in many ways very undeveloped. This is a very different model. Do you see this as also having negative consequences, either unintended or intended? Or do you see this model as somehow offering the germ of an alternative?
Well, I dedicated a chapter about the role of the Chinese in Africa in my last book. It's called The Chinese Are Our Friends, which I think kind of says it all. I think it's fantastic that we have another suitor in Africa. I think it was about time that there was some competition going on. I mean, the whole idea of just having essentially an aid model over the past 40 years has been absolutely damaging. This is not to say that the Chinese don't have issues. And I think, first of all, the Chinese, they're a big lender in the United States. A lot of the things, people seem to forget that when it comes to pointing fingers at Africa. And I think there is a double standard, first and foremost, there. But if you look at China's participation across the African continent, it has changed dramatically even over the past decade. You're right that they were traditionally focused on national resources. Now they are in banking, they're in the retail sector. 85% of the stocks that trade in Africa are non-commodity stocks. So as much as people think it's always a resource trade, that's incorrect. And I think there's a natural symbiosis, if you will, between Africa and China, to the extent that African countries are locked out of the United States, especially in agriculture products, and also locked out with the common agriculture policy in Europe. We have found a country, and other regions as well, who are actually interested in buying African agriculture produce. To me, there's only an opportunity here. There are issues around labor laws, there are issues around environmental concerns, but that, once again, befalls as responsibility to African policymakers. And as much as possible, we should be encouraging African policymakers to do the right thing, but I think this whole scare tactics of neocolonialism and all this is a very unfair stance that a lot of the Western media in particular have taken against China, and I think it's to the detriment. I mean, I'll close by just saying a comment from a friend of mine from Sudan. And I was saying, well, how do you feel? Because there was a Pew survey that came out in 2007 that basically they went to 15 countries in Africa, asked Africans, what do you think about the Chinese? How do you feel? Do you like them? Do you hate them? And I would urge you to have a look at this. I talk about it in Dead Data, but it's also in the, you can go get directly to Pew survey to get their results. But across these 15 countries, consistently by wide margins, 98%, 97%, people said all these countries, they love the Chinese, they think they're doing a better job than the Americans. I think that there's something to be said there about what people felt was really constructive, a constructive contribution to the African people. But my Sudanese friend, and I'll close here, made the point. I said, what do you think about the Chinese? Because people talk a lot about the Chinese supporting these despots. And he said, well, first of all, we know that Western countries have also supported despots over time. But he said, Dambisa, if I look at my life and I have to choose between living under an aid regime, a despot with an aid regime where I don't see economic growth, my children's livelihoods are not improving, things seem to be getting worse, or things are getting worse, and I compare that to another alternative, which is I still live under the despot, but I actually see a road being built, I see infrastructure investment, I see potential for foreign direct investment, I'll choose the latter all the time. It's not ideal, but it's certainly better.
Let's stick with the Africa questions for a bit, if others want to raise specifics on those. Yeah, Barry, and then Uri. You got a mic in the back, and we got a traveling mic up here. Introduce yourself, and then fire away.
Barry Wood, economics journalist. I would like to ask you a little bit more about China in Africa. I think it was in 2010 that development capital or capital into Africa from China exceeded the World Bank's for the first time. I'm wondering, having just come back from 7 weeks in Africa, the opposition that you sense in some countries about the Chinese importing labor for some of these infrastructure projects that you mentioned. And secondly, is the implication of your support of China in Africa, is it logical then to assume that you would advocate that the World Bank scale back its operations in Africa?
Okay, so first to the point of import of labor. As I said to you a moment ago, there are certainly labor issues across Africa. And I think, coming from Zambia, Zambia is a great example of this. We've seen the Zambian government have to respond and address the issue of labor concerns because there have been strikes, there have been uprisings. We don't want them to get to that point, but there certainly is a domestic backlash which is forcing African governments to respond. And I think, in a way, that's what should happen over and above discouraging Chinese investment into the the African continent. The difference between your point about more aid, more Chinese money coming in than aid money is an important one, because the question is not just about the sort of notional amount of money. It's about where does this money end up. By and large, aid monies end up at the states. They want to have the governments involved to help with the delivery of budgetary concerns and so on. But what you end up with there is precisely what I said earlier, which is the idea that because the government is the one receiving this aid, you end up with either at the one extreme issues of corruption, or on the other extreme this idea of governments abdicating their role. Where you have the Chinese investment, it's much more broad-based. There is private sector money coming into the economy from the Chinese, and I think in many ways it is a missed trick from Western countries, because you were there first. We have a traditional relationship, and I do feel like if there had been more investment and more of an approach of Africa being an investment destination as opposed to an aid destination, we'd have a different outcome. Do I think that the World Bank should scale back? You see, I actually think that institutions like the World Bank and the IMF actually have an important role to play, but they really need to recast their thinking. I gave you the example a moment about credit ratings. The World Bank has got a fantastic program, which I talked about in my book. I think it's called GEMLOC, or GEM program, where they actually do try to help countries get credit ratings, issue debt, help these governments, policymakers learn the aspects of being part of the international financial markets. And I think that there's definitely a role for that. But they need to move away from this idea of just seeing African governments as largely as clients to receive aid monies and to do their reports for them. And really today start thinking about how we should be sort of transforming the relationship so that in 10, 15, 20 years from now, we won't have the sort of what I would consider an absurd relationship that exists.
Uri?
Yes, thank you very much. Uri Dadouche with the Carnegie Endowment. First, to say that I have a lot of sympathy for your argument about dysfunctional aid and many of the points that you made. At the same time, and I also agree that there's a large element of sour grapes about the complaints on China investing in Africa at the moment. However, at the same time, going back to Fred's question, there's no question that there's been a significant acceleration of African growth and improved economic performance in the last 10 years. We have just written this, not an advertisement, we've just written a paper on this that came out 2 days ago that looked at it very, very systematically. And that there's been very substantial underlying improvement in policies, macroeconomic policies, openness, increased investment in education, et cetera, that helps explain this acceleration. So my question to you is this. It is clear anybody visiting these countries knows that they have nothing. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it. They have no resources, they have no money, they have no ability to finance a lot of the basic stuff, whatever reason, okay, whatever the history is. How can it be bad to provide them with support? So my question is, what would you do differently? You wouldn't really say, don't give them anything, okay? Don't help them. You surely would not say that. So how would you help them?
Okay.
What is your recommendation?
Okay, so first of all, you're absolutely right. I would not say turn off the taps immediately. I mean, that would be completely absurd. But I think that we have to be, with the respect to the fact that these countries have no resources, I have to say, as somebody who comes from a country that is heavily resource endowed, we've just come out of the biggest bull market in commodities in the past decade. And a lot of the growth that you're talking about in Africa, I would argue, and I think Paul Collier has written a really good paper on this, I would say a lot of that is commodity-driven improvements. And it's still, you're not breaking this 7% that you should be hitting. But how is it that we can look at countries like Zambia like Congo DRC, like Nigeria. These are big countries that are resource endowed. How can we look at those countries and say they don't have resources? Especially, and this is where I take issue, because we have to hold these governments to task. You cannot allow an oil reserve fund in Nigeria to have 20 billion 4 years ago and to be down to 400 million now, and nobody says anything about that. I mean, we cannot give these guys a free pass. I'm sorry, I just think it's absolutely wrong, especially since, look at, people are talking about $22 barrel of oil. We've just had 10 years, I mean, even now, look at where oil prices are. It's impossible for me to understand how you can have zero resources in your bank budget, bank balance as a country, having just come out of this resource and this commodity boom. And I think that implicitly is the problem. But a broader issue is not all countries in Africa are resource dependent. And some of the best performers, Rwanda is a classic example of this, is doing phenomenally well, not because of a commodities boom, but actually because they are fundamentally changing a lot of things. And Rwanda is an interesting case because President Kagame has a very explicit target to wean Rwanda off of aid. But just to illustrate some of the things that he's doing, he's been very, very aggressive on public spending domestically. By the way, Rwanda is one of the countries that's growing over 7% a year. So I think it is a very good test case. He's doing a lot in terms of it becoming a technological hub for the region, which I think is also quite innovative. We'll see how it plays out. And there are obviously there are issues that go on. And it's a small country, it's 10 million people like Zambia, it's landlocked. Are these prospects really something worth hanging your hat on? I think we can have that debate. But I think what we should be doing in terms of aid is providing, like we did for the Marshall Plan, like we did for the Green Revolution, short, sharp interventions. These open-ended commitments, which is essentially what aid is to Africa these days, are simply not working. And I think for countries like Ghana, like Zambia, countries where we actually do see projected revenues, whether it's from resources or whether it's from gains like Rwanda, we should help those countries become much more integrated into the market. We should encourage much more regional integration. These are all things that I know Professor Williamson is in the audience, but so those are the things that we talked about in the Washington Consensus. The reason why a lot of people don't like Washington Consensus is not because it didn't work. In Africa, it was never applied. I mean, you cannot expect a country like Zambia with 10 million people to compete for resources globally with a country like Colombia, which I came from just a few weeks ago. It's much in proximity to the US, a bit more knowledge there. Places like China, bigger economies where the trade seems much more lucrative and obvious. I mean, these countries, 10 million Zambians in one country, regionally 250 million people. It's a very, very, very different proposition. And I think, as I said, if African countries had actually implemented John Williamson's points to a finer point, as opposed to what they actually did, I think we'd have a very different scenario than we do today.
Okay, further questions or discussions on those themes? Yes. And then in the back.
Hello. Thank you very much. I am Dambisa initially from Senegal, but based here in Washington, D.C. with a consulting firm in environment and agriculture and all those trade export readiness we're dealing with, trying to get African people more involved. My question was about how the diaspora, how you see in both books, like how the diaspora themselves, which we are part of, can help those institutions in need to really operating a shift in the paradigm of development, the whole paradigm of development, as you can say. It's like most of those countries are set to failure because we are all dependent on aid itself, and this is really what's impacting Africa. And China knows it, that's why they're in Africa. And the way they operate is whatever problem that the world is about to dealing with China is at this time about to be exported in Africa. Because when they go over, they will take over the resources, and at some point, the decision-making process. So this can be halted if those institutions, the key players, change the way they're dealing with African continent. And I believe the way, one of the things we are trying to push these days with some institutions is trying to have how the diaspora can have a say in the way some policies are being put in place for African development. And I think this might do a lot because it's just a matter of opening eyes to those who need it to see really the obvious. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess, to me, your question is a broader one. It's the role of Africans in general in the debate. I mean, I think one of the things that I found quite shocking is, how few times we hear from African presidents. They're responsible. They are elected officials responsible for this job to, basically to create economic growth, reduce poverty. We very rarely hear from them. And if you ask, even in this room, but broadly people, who do you think it is who really defines African policy, or who is it who's going to the international meetings? I can almost guarantee you will not get a resounding list of African policymakers as names. You'll get a lot more of people who are celebrities or people who have taken it upon themselves, there's nothing wrong with that per se, but as an African, if you're asking us to vote in democratic elections, then we expect something in return. Otherwise, why are we bothering? And I think it goes to the heart of the issue. So with respect to the diaspora, and I get this question all the time, we're concerned about brain drain. It's a very obvious thing. If the government's policies work properly on the ground, Africans will be on their way back home in a heartbeat. Places like Ghana, places like Uganda, we've seen people going back in droves because they felt like there was a real opportunity there. So I do think that there is a real imperative for the international community as a whole to really help to get these policies implemented, not just talk about regional integration, which we've been talking for I don't know how many decades. We're not really doing it as a practical initiative and really moving the needle. But you're right, the diaspora has a role to play in that, whether it's through policymakers or think tanks or in academic institutions in the developed world. But I think it's certainly nowhere near where it needs to be.
Okay, next. Yeah, in the back.
Thomas Volrath from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I noticed early in your remarks, you took, in your indictment of Western aid, you took off the table NGOs. And
that's my next book. No, I'm kidding.
Well, perhaps you can give us some insight in terms of what you will be saying in your next book in assessing those efforts, given the coordination problems and duplication efforts and so forth. And second of all, can you point to some examples, positive examples of attempts by Western institutions that have resulted in positive impacts? I'm thinking of the Millennium Challenge Corporation of the United States, for example, and I'm sure that there are many examples of donors in the Western world from Europe that have had an impact, a positive impact, and I'm wondering whether you can pinpoint some examples out there. Thanks.
Thank you. Coordination problems, you're right. It's not just actually with NGOs, there's also coordination problems at the humanitarian aid levels as well, which are, I think, quite well documented. I didn't really talk about the NGO sector because I think in many ways it is small beer, and everybody knows that they are, in large part problematic in many countries. And if you talk to some ministers in these countries, they say they just can't do any work. That it's a revolving door of everybody with their own agenda from their own country, with their own ambitions and own incentives. And I don't mean it disparagingly, because I do think very often, and by the way, my disclaimer is I am on the board of a couple of NGOs that I think actually work well, which I'll come to in a minute, but I think that there is something to be said of this lack of coordination problem. We know the Accra Accord and all these have really tried to get around this, but I think fundamentally the idea of, and I'll quote somebody from Sweden, one of the ministers in Sweden was saying, well, the problem is that they've got budgets, and every year they've got to meet those budgets. I mean, I know it's quite simplistic, but these are the pressures that they face themselves, and they've got to carve out their agendas. And so in a country like Zambia, we've got over 20,000, it's 10 million, population of 10 million people. I think somebody was telling me that we've got more NGOs in Zambia than we do medical doctors. But I mean, the country is run by NGOs, and if you are a policymaker, you are constantly surrounded by different agencies, sometimes doing the same work. And again, I think as long as we're not moving the responsibility to the hub, to these governments, incentivizing these governments to do the right thing, I think that we end up with the problem of the coordination problems that you've alluded to. Some of the programs that I think are quite interesting, I do talk about the Millennium Challenge account. I think in principle it makes sense, and I guess the idea here is that you give money to only the countries that meet a certain checklist that we consider good and decent. But the problem one of the problems that I talk about and identified in the book is that there's no coordination in that. It's kind of like the financial banking sector, right, in a banking regulation where, one country says Tanzania, and this is a class-specific example. Tanzania under the Millennium Challenge account was deemed to be corrupt, not willing, the government was not willing, U.S. government was not willing to give any money to Tanzania. But the British government months later said this is a model of policy making, we love them and we're going to give them money. So I mean, it's this kind of disjointed, lack of coordinated approach, again, doesn't really help get at the sort of underlying problems. I think one of the interesting ideas that I've heard recently around aid and aid programs is this idea of creating some form of leverage. I actually like the ideas of conditionalities. The problem is that they're never implemented, strongly enough for them to really work. And people know, a lot of the African governments know that, even if they break the condition, they're still going to get aid money. And I think there's obviously, I talk a lot about the political infrastructure that makes that possible. But I think some of the programs that are, rewarding governments for if they're doing the right thing, and this is like David Dollar's paper from way back when, I think have some good ideas, but I think, again, if we have aid in our mind as a solution, I think it's problematic, and this is to this gentleman's point about what do we do instead, and I think there are things that can be done. Let me put it to you this way. The day that Africa is got a higher than 2% trade, the trade tariffs are not 35% between African countries and between Africa and European countries, and they're not locked out of the US market or the European markets. They're much more regionally integrated. Basic things like that. When those things happen, I'll be much more sympathetic to saying, gosh, it hasn't really worked, I think we need to rely on aid. The problem is that there are many things that could help with job creation, that could actually move us towards more democratic, liberal democratic societies that we're not doing already. And that's where I think the issue emerges.
Let me maybe elaborate on that last question and pick up on something you said toward the end of your remarks. Your positive proposal, as I heard it, was to basically pay people to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. So you like the Brazilian scheme where they pay parents if their kids go to school.
Yeah, in interim.
Elaborate a bit. Tell us other examples of that type that you've run across that you think do work, create the right incentives, and have positive potential. Give us some other areas of policy where you think paying directly for results would work. For example, you've talked a couple times about trade. Would you pay countries to reduce their tariffs?
Yes.
Why not have an international fund, run it through the WTO? You set up a disbursement mechanism, and if you reduce your tariffs, thereby, among other things, reducing your government revenues, you get paid for that. Is that the kind of thing you would like?
Let me put it this way. I actually think that the market will pay you. And I'll give a specific example, then I'll come back to your specific question. In 2009, Rwanda became the most improved country on the World Bank's Doing Business survey. Within 2.5 weeks, they had received over $500 million of private capital investment into the country. Now, to me, that is a payment, as a reward for essentially what is good behavior. And I was actually with Paul Wolfowitz not too long ago, about a week ago, 3-4 days ago, and he said to me that he had had a meeting with the minister, Paul Wolfowitz, former head of the World Bank. He had had a meeting with the Tanzanian president, saying to him, listen, did you know that you're number 142 out of 150 countries, worst performers in the world? And he then says that the president of Tanzania was so embarrassed, went to Tanzania, told all his cabinet ministers, I'm so embarrassed, we're number 142 out of 150. And the next year they had moved down, I don't know how many places, but clearly some improvement. And it's not a direct analogy, but to me, implicit in that was some kind of a promise that, listen, if you do better, we will reward you for doing better. But the type of commentary of, oh, actually, the worse that we do, the more poverty, more disease, the more aid we get, I think is running implicitly the problem. Things like foreign direct investment do hinge on credit ratings. I think we should not be off the table to reward countries for getting credit ratings in Africa. We should support them for doing that. But we don't. We discourage them from getting credit ratings. Things like improvements on doing business survey. Why not? If that's the kind of aid we're talking about, I'm much more open to having that discussion instead of an aid that essentially is propping up a system of bad government. But beyond that, let's not forget that the whole aid discourse has moved. Remember, I said earlier that it used to be very specifically about growth and poverty reduction. Well, now, how many times have we heard people say, oh, no, it's not about growth, it's not about poverty reduction, it's because people have HIV, it's because people have got education. Those are important aspects of an economy. But what you have in effect created is aid as a band-aid solution as opposed to aid as support for long-term economic growth to help solve these problems in the longer term. So we are dealing now with band-aid emergency issues, which do call for interventions at the interim. But I think longer term, we're not dealing with these problems at all.
Well, I think you've put your finger on what I've thought over a long career in this business is the fundamental tension in the aid business. Do you reward need or do you reward performance?
Well, I think we should be rewarding for performance because it's this, and I see so many similarities with the American education system. Again, we're rewarding people for bad performance. You look at the American education statistics, they are going down in absolute and relative terms. But we're here talking about last in, first out. We don't care about merit. We're held hostage by teachers' unions. I think there's something implicitly wrong and very, very much a mirror image of what we're seeing in Africa. Why should we be rewarding people when poverty statistics have gotten worse, when governments are not performing to the levels that we expect them to perform to, where there are some pockets of improvements, but nowhere near the 7% that we expect to see. And there are some very, very clear transparent metrics that we could use. Things like the World Bank survey, things like the Transparent International Corruptions, things like credit ratings. These are just simple examples of things that we could use as tools to reward.
Jim Harmon, who actually invests a lot in Africa, and I don't know if you require credit ratings or not, so tell us.
He'll probably say no.
Personally, or? So first I want to congratulate you, Fred, after your, quote, your words, long career. You are focusing a bit more on Africa, which I'm very pleased to say, and to see you do. I wish you had more programs like this. Secondly, I'd like to do the same for Goldman Sachs. I'd like to see Goldman Sachs think a little about Africa. No one at Goldman Sachs even hardly knows a number of the countries in Africa. Now, let me just say a few positive things, agree with the speaker, and then raise a question. One, since our study group of 2004, when we all reviewed how to increase capital flows to Africa, Africa has made significant progress, no matter what measure you want to use, and that there could be a lot more they should do, but made significant progress. So I certainly agree with you and the report that you have made in terms of growth. If you had told us in 2004 the growth would be close to 6% per annum for the continent, sub-Saharan Africa, and for so many countries, we wouldn't have believed it at that time. So I'm delighted to hear that. Secondly, if you take the evaluation of publicly quoted companies, any sector you want throughout sub-Saharan Africa, you will find multiple of earnings and of book value comparable to much of the frontier world. Now, here and there are some exceptions, but Africa has attracted significant private sector investment from private funds, excluding even, quote, the private equity world. So it's reached a level where the cost of capital for the private sector in sub-Saharan Africa is encouraging. I could not have said that 6 or 7 or 5 years ago. So then I would say that the leadership is improved. So I totally agree with the speaker on Kagame and Rwanda. Rwanda just did its first public offering, 6 times oversubscribed by foreign investment, on a price to multiple of beer companies, which is comparable to the rest. Kagame's doing a lot of the right things. Many of us want to clone him and first place him in Zimbabwe and then some other countries. His success at becoming a model for Africa will move a lot of the needle in our judgment. Finally, I would say, beside him, there's a lot of other leadership that's improved. You have to say over the 10-year period of time, less conflict, obviously, the end of the Cold War 10 years earlier than that. A lot of good things have happened to move Africa. At 2% of global trade, by the way, that's up from 1%, because when we were looking at it back in 2004, it was the bottom of the pyramid. By far, it has made some progress in that area. So I have to leave with somewhat of an optimistic feeling. I think the progress and the learning and the knowledge, any of us who travel to Africa now see improvement at the public sector. Country after country are aware of a lot of what you're saying. Yes, we should make changes on aid. We can improve that. But by and large, it should, I don't say pop the champagne, but I'd say get it warmed up.
Cooled off.
Cool down.
Cool down.
Cool it off. Cool it off. Sorry. That comes from someone. I don't drink enough champagne to have given you the analogy. Thank you.
Dambisa, could I move from your first basket case, Africa, to your second basket case, the West? And and ask the following. You talked about the short-termism of Western governments, particularly the United States government, and the long-run unintended consequences. And one can make similar comments about the private sector. It used to be said that one of the good things about the US economy compared to Europe and Japan was that we didn't let zombie companies and zombie banks sort of go on forever, but then the market dealt swift justice. More recently, there's been a lot of criticism of the fact that American companies have been too short-term, encouraged by the analysts, and there are now all these efforts to try to affect executive compensation in ways that will make managements look more long-term. You know, where would you find, or what metrics would you use to find a happy medium, you know, to find the optimum between short-termism that says, after me the deluge, and the long-termism which seems to prop up the dead for significant periods?
So I guess in the private sector, I'm quite sympathetic to the idea of deferred compensation. I think it obviously the devil's in the detail, as they say, but I think that there's something to be said of getting people to have a vested interest in a corporation having a going concern. And I know there's a lot of discussion about penal, you know, sort of a more penal approach that, you know, if after the fact the trade doesn't work, well, then you better go and get that person and arrest them or charge them some tariff. But I mean, I think for me, I really don't like this idea of sort of a penal approach necessarily. I think in general we should be incentivizing people to do the right thing, and I think deferred compensation is sort of an obvious way to do that. And I think there have been significant strides already, you know, so quite significant movements in this direction. I know the EU have come up with some papers, some proposals around when your shares can vest and how much money you can get in cash versus stocks and so on. I mean, I think the issues here about short-termism are really embedded in the culture of capitalism, and it definitely has swung quite dramatically to this idea of it's here and now, I need to do this as quickly as possible. But I'm quite sympathetic to deferred compensation. I don't know if that answers your question.
Dambisa, you're a member of the board of directors of Barclays, which has had some,
had to say that, didn't
which has had some well-publicized compensation issues lately. Use that as a case example that I presume you know a good deal about.
Well, talk about putting somebody on the hot seat. Well, I mean, I think that we're in a transition period, is the truth. I mean, you know, people have been promised certain these kind of like pensions. People have been promised things for a long time. They've invested their time and their energies under the expectations that I wasn't there at the time, but, you know, as the board or the different organizations promised. And sometimes it's not organizations, it's the market that promises certain things. And the market might say, listen, you know, if Bank A doesn't pay this amount of money, well, Bank B will pay you. And so we could easily start to lose people. So there is this sort of chicken versus egg issue. But to your point, I mean, as I said, I think we are in a transition period, because I think the people who work in this environment understand that a lot of what has happened, it means that we have to change this, really try and structure. And it's an industry-wide thing. We're trying to restructure how people are paid. But how do you do that when you've actually already promised people that you're going to pay them a certain amount of money? So it is very challenging. I mean, I think the only other thing I would say about this is that and I quote this in my book because I think it was Barney Frank who said, oh, you know, it's something to the effect, and the actual quote is in my book, but something to the effect that managers of businesses are not there to be risk takers. Well, actually they are. That's why that's their raison d'etre, is to actually take risk. And the issue is, if you look at the contingent capital analysis, you've got the stockholders, they love risk. That's why they put their money in this thing. They don't expect to get bond-like returns. They expect to get, you know, risky asset-type equity returns. But at the same time, that's why you've got the bondholders. The bondholders are the calm guys who are supposed to sit there and say, wait a minute, excuse me, Mr. Equity guy, excuse me, Mr. Management, you're over-leveraged, you're spending too much money, and so on. But the problem is, once again, the unintended consequences. When government says to the bondholders, don't worry, whatever happens, I'm going to pay you back, it invariably means that the bondholders say, hey, I'm relaxed. And we've seen it at the macro level. When the Chinese came into the United States and said, listen here, we're worried about this financial crisis, we've lent you a lot of money, and the US government says, don't worry, we're going to pay you. There's obviously, it lets you, or let's even take a more individual example, the FDIC. I know I put money in my bank. I don't have to worry about whether the bank is taking my money and investing in stocks or bonds or wherever they are, because I know that for up to $250,000, I'm covered. The government's told me not to worry about it. Now, maybe I'll start worrying about who's running the bank if it gets above $250,000. But the fact of the matter is, those type of guarantees, which sound like good ideas, we want people's money to be protected, can lead to bad behavior. And I think what we're grappling with in many different sectors, not just in banking, I think also in industry as well, is how do we reward people to incentivize them to do the right thing, but at the same time, don't detract the responsibility of doing the right thing also.
All right, last question, Flozell.
I had been thinking very much about your general theme about unintended consequences, even when people have good intentions, governments have good intentions. And I wanted to sort of just a philosophical point and then a question about, are there any Western governments that have done sort of the right things and gotten the right kinds of outcomes? But what I was thinking was that at any point in time when governments make decisions about what they're going to do, they perhaps bring together sort of the best thinkers, the right folks who are either in cabinet or wherever they are, and based on the current circumstances and looking at what they see, these quote unquote best minds make a decision to do certain things. And then only, in hindsight, do we then get to be able to look back and see that, oh my gosh, we had these unintended outcomes from what were good intentions and what we thought were good policies at the time. And so I was sort of thinking, how do any governments at this point, whether they are Western governments or African governments, basically from where you sit, look at what we have in front of us and somehow make the right decisions that 10 years down the road or 20 years down the road, they won't be going like, oh my God, how did we do this and get these done? And is there any Western government that's done it right?
Okay, so I think that's a very good question. What I would say is find the experts. To me, I'll give a very specific example, the TARP, American TARP. I would argue that there clearly was a role for government to step in. Government had to do something. Things were going awry. But it's sort of the art of war. If you're going to play in the financial markets, make sure you've got people who understand the financial markets on your team. And I look, even now, when I look at the US government, I think the traders, and we're just talking about one of the best minds in finance right now, Mohamed El-Arian, who I think is phenomenal. I mean, these are the people that you want to be in the government because they know exactly how the hedge fund managers, the private equity guys, they know how they think, what they want in terms, not just for investment, but also how they might look for loopholes, not illegal, by the way, but how they would play the markets. They would know how to buy low and sell high. And instead, if you staff yourself with policy wonks or academics, which are all great, I am one, I should point out, you end up with people who are buying high and selling low. And you just have to get into the discipline, like it or not, get the traders. I mean, I really believe if they had taken, instead of, if the TARP people, just even now, if you go and hire the best Goldman Sachs trader or Barclays trader or a Morgan Stanley trader to come and run the government, really help run the government finances, or certainly where the government interfaces with the, sorry? I hear a Sarky comment, but I couldn't hear it.
No, I think the comment would be that the last administration had Hank Paulson.
No, but Hank Paulson this is a good example. He's an investment banker. He's not a trader. He's an investment banker. He's not a trader. And the guy who he hired was a vice president in investment banking, not a trader. If you've got to get traders, they're the ones who understand the markets. They understand what a 10 basis point move. They understand what $100 oil means. They understand why it would be $100. And I think this is exactly why you get back-footed. I mean, it's the same. This is what I was talking about with the role of the World Bank. I can't tell you how many African ministers I've met who have no clue about how to issue debt in the international capital market, don't even know it's an option to them. You're going to get run over by the international financial markets if you don't even know basics of what is out there, how big is the market, what does it mean. Which countries do I think are doing some interesting things? Well, listen, I don't think there's any one country. I think that we're in this amazing different model phase. I think the thing that shocks me is that the United States, which has sort of been the beacon of private sector development and so on, is now got 35% corporate taxes. I think this is bizarre to me. 10 percentage points higher than the OECD average is at 25%. There's something wrong here. It seems a bit bizarre. Somebody from Denmark said to me, well, the difference, and I think this is quite poignant, is that the Scandinavian countries, which have also had a financial crisis, Sweden in the late 1990s, they actually just decided as a society that they're happier to be taxed at the income level, personal incomes, they've got higher personal incomes taxes, but their corporate tax levels are relatively low. And so, I don't know what that dynamic is. I think we're all trying to find that out, and I think we live in a fantastic time again, because the number 1 and 2 countries on GDP basis, the US and China, have completely different models. So I think it's probably a place to end.
Okay, we're at our witching hour. Dambisa, thank you very much. Thanks again to Marina and Bob.
Thank you.
We appreciate it greatly.